Hello and welcome back to my channel. Let's talk some books. Today I'm going to update you on what I have recently been reading, and we're going to discuss most, if not all, of these books. And let's just go ahead and get right into it because I've got quite a few things to talk to you about. So I'm going to start by saying I have recently read both of these books, but I'm not going to review them in this video, but let me tell you where you can find the reviews for them. So the first one is The Return of the Soldier by Rebecca West. This is a reread for me. I actually read it earlier this year, so I will link in the description box below where you can find my review on this book. I absolutely loved it, and I'm rereading it because I'm actually talking about it with my channel members for our book club. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. That is coming up soon. So that is super excited. In fact, at the time that I'm filming it, it's 2 days away. So yay! The second book is Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow. I will be talking about this book again in this video, but the actual review for this is going to be over at my friend Alex's channel, and I will link her channel and eventually the video below. But for now, here are some clips of what you can look forward to in that book discussion.
Today, Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow. So we're now 3 books into our high school rereading challenge.
I had like multiverse in mind, and then somehow this other guy, Kohlhaas Walker, like is going to be involved. So I thought he was also going to be the protagonist of the book and at the beginning, and that maybe like it was outside his home that the Houdini event happened. Those were my expectations going into the book.
It was assigned for me my sophomore year of high school. That's what got it onto this list. What's a book that you know you had to read, but you have forgotten? And that was this book for me. Really don't hear a lot of people talking about the book. And it was in trying to plan out what books to assign my own son who is homeschooled and now in the high school years where this book came back to mind. Will I assign this to him? We'll get into that.
Something about it just grated on my nerves. I just felt like it was like,
I liked it, but I was also confused about it. This is the modern American family. Father has worked hard all day. Good job, father. And like, mother is sure to have the meal prepared for him when he comes home. And so that's what it sounded like because everything was like, mother did this. Father thought this. I was on one of like those spinning rides where I was enjoying it the whole time, yet I was kind of disoriented. Next question in our outline is, why do you think this is taught in high school? And we've
all right, now that we have that out of the way, I'm going to go and talk to you about these 3 books. There's going to be lots of like cut scenes in here because what happened is I filmed myself discussing these 3 books, and I thought that was going to be one video and that the other 2 books I'm going to talk about were going to be a different video, and I decided that that doesn't make sense. So I've read these 3, so let me take you what is, for me, now the past and tell you what I thought about these 3 books. I'm going to start with the first book that I feel like I read a while ago, and I really enjoyed it, and I think I actually finished it at the end of June? What month are we in? July? Anyway, the book is Gray Bees, and this is a translated work by Andrey Kurkov. It's translated from Russia. He is a Ukrainian author, and this was translated by Boris Adrelia. And this book was just translated into English in 2020, but has actually been out since 2018. And this edition is published by Deep Vellum. And I'm so glad it was translated into English because this was well worth the read. Gray Bees is a book that is giving you the experience of everyday life as a person living in a village or a small town, or just going about their business in the midst of the chaos of a war zone. And in this case, specifically in the midst of the conflict that is going on in Ukraine, or at least modern day conflict, in this case, all the way up to around 2018. This book gives you a really good sort of beginner's background to the ongoing conflict in that area. This book is told with humor and humanity and follows the travels of our protagonist, Sergei, when he starts out in no man's land with just him, one other neighbor, and his bees that are his last responsibility. And we follow him as he tries to find a place of safety, moving himself from the no man's land, which is basically the space between the loyalist and the separatists. And he's just trying to find a home and a safe resting place so that his bees can come out when spring arrives and start making some honey. And Sergei has been living for some time, I think 3 to 5 years at this point in the book, in this no man's land. He's still in his home village, but at this point, his village is falling apart. There may be some military action coming into his village, certainly in the form of the occasional shell, and even sometimes in the form of a soldier or two or more. But him and his neighbor, or his frenemy as he likes to call him, are just trying to make do despite the fact that there's been no water, no food, no stores, and no one in town for quite some time. But Sergei eventually reaches the point where he realizes that this just isn't going to be suitable for him, nor more importantly for his bees, and so he sets out from his home village to try and find a new place for them to rest. And this takes him basically on both sides of the conflict. So I really appreciate the fact that you get sort of a varied view of everything that's going on. He spends some time on the side of the loyalists and some time on the side of the separatists, as it's referred to. And he just is really trying to find his way and figure out what is going on, and while trying to remain neutral and in the gray zone himself, if you will. I was very impressed with this book. This book discusses the topic of war and the conflicts that have been ongoing in Ukraine, so it does give you some background that would help you understand just a little bit more about the conflict that is still going on there. But this book also talks about friends. It's a bit of a found family story going on. There is some romance and just general discussions of relationships. Highlights for me in this book for sure were the characters. Even the characters that you weren't sure of or weren't necessarily the most likable people, you couldn't help but at least sympathize with. They were very complex. There's a bit of a magical feeling in the way that this story is told, and I really just enjoyed it through and through. I don't know that I would really say that there were any low moments in the story for me. I really did enjoy my time with Sergei and his little village, as well as the time when he goes and visits the village next door, as well as both the trips that he goes on, if you will, and even his frenemy. I don't know, I couldn't help but like him a little bit as well. And you will have a lot of mixed feelings about what's going on in this time and in this village, and you will find yourself, if you're like me, trying to and wanting Sergei to make some certain decisions, but not everything is black and white. A lot of things are gray as it goes. I really enjoyed this read. I gave it 5 stars, and I would recommend it to anyone who likes just exploring characters in unique situations, anyone who is interested in learning just a little bit more about the conflict in Ukraine. I think this is a really good introduction to that without hitting you over the head with one point of view. I think it does show not just what life would be like in Ukraine specifically during this time period, but potentially what life is like anytime you are surrounded by chaos that is completely outside your control. And I think there are just a lot of beautiful things to be said about this book and how it was written. And I think if you enjoy historical fiction, you will enjoy this, and it may help you consider a couple of different points of view about what's going on there that you may have not thought of before. I also feel like this is a book that will spark your curiosity and make you want to keep learning more and following and caring about what's happening there and the people of Ukraine. And I was pleasantly surprised by this book. I was not expecting it to be a 5. I was hoping somewhere in the 4 to 5 range, and I'm glad it landed on a 5. And yeah, I will look forward to rereading this sometime in the future. The next book I read is a new release debut novel, and that is Archive of Unknown Universes. And I've got to say, I absolutely love this cover. I love the colors. I love just sort of the way the whole thing is rendered. And yeah, I would love to say that this was a very happy book, and in some ways, maybe kind of it's a more hopeful book than anything else. But let me tell you what it's about. Archives of Unknown Universes is literary fiction with a blend of historical fiction and sci fi. Definitely soft sci-fi. So if you like books that are a bit of a genre blend, then this is definitely one that you might be interested in. This book is based on the historical conflict that was the Salvadorian Civil War, and we follow two main characters, Luis and Ana. Ana, I would say, is definitely a bit more of the protagonist than Luis, and we follow them and their family as they try to uncover more information about their parents' past involvement and experiences in the El Salvadorian Civil War, as well as learn more about what that means for them in the present. That is just one of the perspectives that we follow, which is really two perspectives, because we do get a little bit of point of view from each of them. One of the other time periods that we are in, because they are in 2018, is 1978 through 1980, which is basically the time period from just before the El Salvadorian Civil War to the point at which it starts or kind of starts kicking off. And in that timeline, we are following Rafael and Nito, who I'm assuming are these two right here. They are from two different countries, Nicaragua and El Salvador, but they meet at a meeting in Havana, and there they discover that not only do they have similar jobs and interests, but that they also have maybe a romantic interest in one another. And so this follows them as they go through their timeline and trying to figure out how best to serve their country, and it explores their hopes for freedom, both for their country and for themselves. And then at some point, you kind of sort of maybe get a third timeline, or maybe there's four timelines. This is where it gets a little hazy. So be warned, pay very, very close attention to the dates. I realize that I don't think I was paying as close attention to that as I should have. And to give you an idea, the chapters do start with what year you are in. So that is the best way to place yourself in the book, because there is at least one other timeline that I noticed, but I didn't notice it until about partway through the book. And by that point, I think I was confused because another character seemed to suddenly enter, but that timeline may have existed from the very start of the book, and I may not have noticed. But before I get into that, let me tell you some of the things that I enjoyed about this book. I really appreciated a lot of the themes that were discussed here. I personally did not know a lot about the El Salvadorian Civil War, but I find that is very relevant to me here in the US, as I am aware that there are a lot of people in the US who are originally from El Salvador and have sought asylum and are asylum seekers here in the US. And that has become a big political thing in the US. I feel like maybe has always been a big political thing in the US, and I'm not going to get into that, but I appreciated the discussion and the way that this broached that topic. You definitely spend a lot of time in the point of view of both the current and past people, I would say for the most part. There is a little discussion of their future selves, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But I think it was really the discussion that the characters in the present day 2018 had about the past that I appreciated the most, because it gets into a lot of discussion, or at least they attempt to get into discussions with their family members about how they originally came to the US seeking asylum, how it's necessary, particularly at the time, to seek asylum in the US on US soil. Thus, it requires you to cross the border to declare yourself seeking asylum first, and into some of the nitty gritty details that I think sometimes get overlooked in news bites. And it also gives you a perspective that's on a more human level as opposed to a news level or a political level or that kind of thing. And it just introduced a lot of topics that I really wanted to look into some more. Now, I mentioned that there is a little bit discussion about their future selves in this book, getting into the soft sci-fi aspect. There is a machine called a diffractor, and that is an invention that exists at some point in their lives. I'm not sure actually what the timeline of when the diffractor first was invented in the book, but it's basically a machine that is sort of like a cube that you get to look into, and it just shows you like a whole bunch of little video clips based on any question you ask it. And those video clips will show you all the potential futures that could exist for you. I would say this is soft sci-fi, which means it doesn't really get into the science of how that works. It's definitely not supposed to be magic. It's definitely supposed to be a type of technology. And there is a lot of questioning in the book about whether it's truly doing what it says it's doing or if it's just making up things on you. Now, how they get the video footage, how all of that is coming together, how this could be a technological device, none of that is discussed. That's not the point. I think having the diffractor brought up a lot of interesting conversations, but don't go into this book thinking that it's going to be a significant part of the story. It's definitely a sub-genre. I think the only downside for me, or the thing that I struggled with, was just keeping all the timelines and people straight. There are like just a handful of main characters in this book and secondary characters, but because the times seemed to jump around, I started to lose track of how the storylines were supposed to go. I think there are supposed to be at least two timelines that are sort of mirrors of one another. So one is a timeline if things went a certain way, and the other is a timeline if things went a different way. It took me quite a while to figure that out, and I'm still not sure which timeline is the way that history kind of exists and which one's sort of like the alternate history. I'm not even sure if that's what actually happened. I did look up at some reviews on the book, and it does seem like that's what the point was supposed to be. And this was a moment where I wasn't sure if I just didn't have enough historical background about the conflict to understand what the author was saying, if it just wasn't clear in the book, or if maybe I just needed the book to have just a little bit more historical information in it. Either way, it did like make me have to go on the struggle bus. Like, maybe that's why it's yellow. But anyway, I still gave it 4 stars. I did really enjoy this book. I thought that it explored relationships and the difficulties in relationships really well. And it did make me a bit curious about the El Salvadorian Civil War. I wish there, like I said, was just a little bit more history about that, or that the author just assumed we knew a little less, or at least assumed that I knew a little less than he thought he would. Like I would have been okay with this book being longer, like 20 pages longer, just to sprinkle throughout more about the war and the conflict. And also that there maybe along with the chapter headings had have not just been a date, but maybe some indication of what timeline we were following. Like if there were two timelines that happened at the same time, I could have used a 2018.1 versus a 2018.2, something like that. Most people did seem to think that if you paid a lot of careful attention to the dates and locations from the very, very start of the story, that helped. Slightly doubtful about that. That said, like I mentioned, I gave it 4 stars. I would recommend it to anyone who likes a good genre blend, who particularly likes historical fiction and literary fiction, because I think those are the two that the book most heavily relies on, and anyone who is interested in the immigrant experience, particularly that from El Salvador, and just understanding a little bit more about what went on in El Salvador and what led to the migration into the US, and I don't know, explore different points of view. I feel like that is like a common theme in a lot of what I'm reading today, including the next book that I'm going to talk about. So the final book that I have here is What Kingdom? This is translated from Danish, and this is just a short little book. I would consider it to be a novella, and that actually works really well in this book. So let me share with you what this book is about. In short, What Kingdom is about everyday life on a psychiatric youth ward. In fact, I believe the title in Danish is The Youth Ward, or that was at least intended to be the original title of the book. And in here, you are following an unnamed narrator as she accounts her time in this psychiatric ward for youth. It is a temporary ward, which means it is not a permanent home for the 15 or so youth that are there, but it is just a place that they are supposed to go between the hospital and home, or prison and home, or somewhere else. And It's basically a transitional location. I do want to say right off the bat that there are a lot of trigger warnings that you should check out for this book. It does discuss mental health, and I think it's a really good conversation about it. But because you're getting it from the point of view of one of the mental health patients that are there, it does get into all the things, the highs and the lows that can occur on a psychiatric ward. And I know that's something that some people may be sensitive to. I here in talking about it will try to avoid getting into any of those details just because I also don't want to get into any plot spoilers. You follow our first person narrator and her time while she is on this ward, and you really get to experience the psychiatric ward through her eyes, as well as occasionally sort of getting disassociated from her a little bit and sort of moving about the room sometimes, if you will. But it is a really fascinating look. I know the author's intent in writing this was to sort of give a more modern view and perspective of a psychiatric ward. I believe she said at one point that this is a topic that's fairly prominent and popular in some ways in fiction and literature and even in films. In fact, even within this book, the movie Girl Interrupted is mentioned, and I think she's quite right that it is something that is frequently discussed in literature and art in general. And so I appreciate her taking the time to address this issue and sort of give a more modern view and perspective on it that I think is honestly a bit more compassionate than some other options may be. The book is split into three parts: the Rules and Corridor, which discusses sort of the living arrangements; Containment, which gets into the care, if you will, or the way that the patients sometimes find or feel contained. The third section is called Secrets, and well, there's secrets in there, so I won't tell you what they are. And it is definitely a short and dizzying way of presenting the information. And I think that's where the shorter sections come in. You definitely have a lot of little vignettes of her life in this ward. I appreciate in a lot of ways that she remains unnamed, even though there are names given to a lot of the other people around her. And I think there are a lot of important themes that come up in this book. A lot of the focus of this book is on the language that is used to talk about the different people living in this psychiatric ward, what things are called by the caretakers, as well as what the things are called by the people who are being taken care of. It's also a really good look at care in general, as well as who truly has responsibility for these young adults. Are they truly responsible for themselves if they're not free to move about? Should that be something that is done? And if it's a temporary place for them, at what point are they responsible and well enough to move on to something of their own? I did give this book 5 stars. I would definitely read it again. There was a lot for me to think about, and that's despite the fact that I found the end of this book a little bit confusing. The last few pages, I wasn't quite sure or clear on exactly what was happening, though I got the gist of it, and I did still like the ending. So it's interesting that this one was confusing and got a 4 star, and this one was a little bit confusing and got 5. The difference is I'm not sure that rereading this would clarify it, and I'm not sure that this is the type of book that I would reread. This book, however, had so many multifaceted things to talk about, and I think did them all so well that I could see rereading it at least once, and it's definitely a book that I would gift to someone. I would recommend this book to anyone who is interested in mental health or likes to see that represented well in books or is interested in reading about that. I would again caution that you check trigger warnings if you know anything related to hospitalization or mental health could be a trigger for you. And I would also recommend this to anyone who is just looking for a fresh perspective, any book on mental health. I do think it's important to know that the author herself has had experience of being on a psychiatric ward, and I think that shows in how she both handled the variety of different situations that came up and how she discussed the different people in the book. And yeah, I was very pleasantly surprised by this book. It doesn't have a writing style that would normally be what I would look for, but I did really enjoy it, and I'm glad I read it. Okay, have you caught up on everything? Do you know everything that I've read so far? Let me tell you about the final two books, which are these two books here. And I'm going to go ahead and start with the one that just happens to be on top. So the first book I'm going to talk with you about is One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. And this is by Alexandr Solzhenitsyn. I always say his last name wrong. That's about as close as I can get. But this is a book that is a short work of fiction. It is a classic of Russian literature and was published in 1962. It is based on the author's firsthand experience of being in Soviet-run labor camps in Siberia, and it is intended to communicate the then unknown experience of what it was actually like for one day in the life of an inmate at these labor camps. Up to this point in time, there had really been no talk or discussion about what was going on in the Soviet Gulag system, and this author brought a lot of that to light, and I believe was at that point one of the first authors or writers to really start publicly criticizing Stalin era anything, really. So let's go ahead and talk more specifically about what this is about. First of all, it is very much in line with the title. It discusses one day in the life of a very specific man, Ivan Denisovich. He is a former Russian soldier who has been falsely accused and sentenced to 10 years in a Siberian labor camp. This work is set in the 1950s, and we literally start the beginning of Ivan's day with him from the time he wakes up, realizes he's not feeling well, as he then proceeds with his day, where we get to experience the tiny bit of unintentional free time, if you will, that he has, how he spends that trying to seek out a little bit of medical care, and the adventures and misadventures, if you will, that he has along the day as he just tries to make it through another day in this labor camp. Along the way, we have encounters with guards. We see the various types of punishments, minor and major, that may occur within the labor camp itself. We get to learn a lot about the friends and enemies that an inmate can have and or make as time goes by. And you also learn a lot about the routines, the rules, and the various types of work that Ivan, as well as other inmates, may have to do during this time period. You, as a reader, definitely get to experience the highs, the lows, the surprises, and even to some extent the hunger and desires and longings that the inmates experience as they are there, including the unknown factor of just how long will your sentence last. There was a lot in this book that worked really well towards communicating what it is like to be an inmate in the Gulag at this time, and I think the structure of the book was a big part of that. Having a character that you could go and follow throughout a sort of not really 24-hour period, but day-long period, was really useful in just getting into all the different nuances of things that could happen throughout the day. You got to both experience the sort of forced and set routine, as well as the way that prisoners kind of attempt to steal and make time for themselves. Time is a very heavy and present element in this book, despite the fact that the prisoners don't have watches and so don't ever know the actual literal time of day. Again, that reinforces the routine because you see how the routine and the daily experience gives them a sense of time. I think another great author choice in the writing of this book was actually the point of view. I would have expected this book to be a first-person point of view, and it wasn't. There was an omniscient narrator here who did follow very closely with Ivan, but not having it remain a first-person narrative or be a first-person narrative meant that you also got to see a little bit of other prisoners' experiences, and I almost think more importantly, to get a perspective, at least in brief, of what the life of the guards were like, and you slowly come to realize that life in this system, and particularly in Siberia, is not easy for anyone who is forced or at least encouraged to be there. The guards, while not necessarily sympathetic characters, are ones that you also start to question how they are being treated and the conditions that they are involved in. So in that sense, the enemies or antagonists in this book aren't necessarily the ones that you expect. So there are two things in this work that I feel like didn't serve it as well as I was expecting, and one of it is actually the prose itself. This work is narrated in my edition by Ralph Parker, and I don't get the sense that it was a translation problem. Everything I've read on this has just talked about how the writing style is very accessible, and I would absolutely agree with this. It was a very easy read, pretty straightforward. Reminds me of sort of like a local newspaper. That makes the book really accessible. However, I didn't feel like it really served our protagonist well at all times. It sometimes did cause the book to feel a bit slow and pace and for the story to drag a little bit. And I don't think that was necessarily the intention of the author. I really think the intention of the author was for the writing to not be distracting from the story and to actually make the book accessible to most people so that this experience could spread and that more people could understand what was going on up in Siberia. And I think it's effective in that sense. But again, I feel like it kept me from really moving through the story in a way that would have kept me engaged. I also think that the pacing itself in this book was a little off towards the middle. There is a part of the day, if you will, that really kind of drags. At the same time, that may be intentional. Like, there was definitely a point where I felt like this day is never going to end. Overall, I did enjoy this book. It's always odd to say that you enjoyed a book that's about a rather heavy and kind of sad topic, but I thought it was a really well done work. I did end up giving it 4 stars, and I thought it was solid. I think there was a part of me that was really expecting this to be a 5-star read because I feel like that's how I've heard most people talk about it, but I thought it was just okay. And so I think I'm mainly giving it a 4-star read because I have heard this is a good place to start with this author. And I would agree, having read none of his other books, that it probably is because it's so approachable. However, I don't know that I would say in the long run that it is because it didn't really encourage me to read more of his writing. So I'm still going to move on despite that because I own one other work by him, which is Cancer Ward. So I think I'm going to stay on the fence as to whether or not I like him as an author, but I will definitely try him again. I would say this book is best for people who are interested in learning more about the Gulag or the Soviet prison system, especially in the 1950s, who like to read books or are curious about books that have to do with prison systems and or the lives of inmates, who like books that are character studies and just follow somebody in their human experience and their suffering who is just trying to learn and figure out how to cope and make it from day to day. It's definitely hopeful in that sense and inspiring as you learn about how he and these other people learn to survive even amongst the most dehumanizing circumstances. And in that sense, I think it is a good read along those lines. All right, let's move on to my next book. And this is one that came as a surprise and I was not expecting or intending on reading. In fact, I knew nothing about this book until until I read Ragtime with Alex. And that is Michael Kohlhaas. I meant to look up the last name. I'm pretty sure that's how it's pronounced. And this is by Hienrich von Kliest. And yeah, this story came up, like I said, in the middle of Alex and I reading Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow. That is a work that has a character called Kohlhaas Walker. So you can see some of the similarities in the one's first name and this man's last name. And the entire middle of Ragtime was actually a homage to this book, as said E.L. Doctorow himself. And so as we were reading that and we kept hearing more and more about this book, we finally just gave up and said, it's a short book, let's give it a try. So while in the book discussion that I mentioned, you will be able to hear us talk about Ragtime, we don't actually review Michael Kohlhaas in that video. And so I'll go ahead and review it now and give you my thoughts on it. Michael Kohlhaas is a novella and a classic work of German literature. It was published originally in 1810, and this is actually a newer translation that was recently released in English in 2020. It is translated by Michael Hoffman. I think it's funny and maybe not a surprise that they share a first name. And this book explores the idea of retributive justice and also the need for justice in an unjust society. It also kind of explores the idea of how monomania can lead to the corruption of even good individuals. It was definitely something that when we found out these two stories were connected, we really wanted to hear more of this story, I think partially because that was the most interesting part of Ragtime. So let me go ahead and tell you more specifically what this book is about. This tells the story of a well-respected horse dealer who is just on his way to go and sell his horses from one town to the next, and on his way he passes by the local nobleman's estate. He then finds that some rules have apparently changed in regards to travel, and the next thing he knows, his horses are confiscated, and his entire world is very quickly turned upside down as the corrupt nobleman and his minions, for lack of a better word, abuse him, his horses, and virtually everyone he is connected with. He decides to take matters into his own hands and seek justice any way he can find it. This very quickly spirals out of control, and then the entire book basically follows him on his path of retributive justice, which very quickly seems to lead to the path of vengeance and revenge. And things go on from there, and it really does follow him as the corruption seems to take over even the things that are good. There was definitely a clear demarcation between the haves and haves not, and it certainly emphasizes the ability of power to corrupt, especially when it's held in just a few hands. The power, that is, not the corruption. I mean, both can be held in just a few hands, and in this book they definitely are. I think the things that serve this book the best are the character of Michael himself, especially at the outset of the book. You very quickly like him and feel like you are on his side. And I think the action also leads to a very fascinating tale. It is initially very quick paced and there is a lot going on, and you really just want Michael to be the hero of the story and to have things work out in his favor. I think what makes this book a bit of a struggle is that there are a lot of people very quickly introduced into this book with very minimal characterization. I will admit I listened to the vast majority of this on audiobook. I had no intention initially of buying the book. I got about maybe a little bit more than halfway through the book and suddenly found myself lost in the audiobook. So there are some historical references that I think were kind of lost on me, partially by the pacing of this book and the lack of characterization, and maybe partially because I was listening to an audiobook. Be warned, I don't think this is the best book to listen to on audiobook, at least maybe not for your first encounter with it. Despite that, I did end up giving this book 4 stars. I do want to reread the entire thing physically at some point, which really won't take that long, in hopes that that will clarify that middle section. So I do have the feeling that this has the potential of moving up in terms of rating. I would recommend this book to anyone who is a fan of the general themes of justice or injustice, or likes to look at stories of like redemption that have to do with retributive justice, that kind of thing. I would also recommend this to anyone who likes postmodern writing styles, because to have been written in the 1810s, I feel like this writing style seems very similar to a postmodern writing style. This book has been really influential, so you may also want to read this book if you read Ragtime and you liked the story of Kohlhaas Walker in there. If you've seen the 2013 movie called Michael Kohlhaas, if you are a fan of J.M. Coetzee's work, in 1983 he wrote a book called The Life and Times of Michael K., which is based off of this book. And also, and I found this one the most satisfying and interesting, the opening sentence of Perfume by Patrick Susskind is an homage to this book. So there are all the reasons that I can say you might want to read it, you might find it interesting. It is in the public domain, at least here in the US, so you can find free editions online for sure of this book, or you could check your local library or ebooks or however you get your books if you don't necessarily want to purchase it. Okay, so I think that is it. Yeah, I talked to you about everything. Let me show you the pile again. So hopefully in this video, I've at least told you how you can find reviews of all these books, even if I haven't necessarily reviewed these two. And I guess I should also show you what I am currently reading and working on. I am currently still working on Clarissa, which is my year-long read, and I have started Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. That is the book club pick for August, and I am giving myself a nice jump start on it. Anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and let me know how your month of reading is going, and I'll talk to you next time. The loyalist, and the separatist, and it. And what else is going on? Do you even really need to know that? Probably not. Okay, anything else?